Hi, I'm Stephen Wilson and you're watching Noise 11. Enjoy.
And we welcome Stephen Wilson back to Australia and into noise11.com. Congratulations. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And, congratulations on the speed in which the tickets sold for the tour this time, where you've sort of knocked out and surprised that, a couple of sold-out shows in no time this time round.
I'm always surprised that anyone wants to listen to my music or come and see the show in a way, because it's very strange when you do something very selfish in a way. Making music for me is a very selfish kind of act, and I don't sort of expect anyone else to like it or to connect with it. So it's always a very pleasant surprise when there's any interest, particularly when it's on the other side of the planet. I don't necessarily have a lot of feedback on a daily basis. I'm not the kind of person who spends a lot of time on social networking sites, so I really don't know. I don't know what interest there is out there, and you can't really tell necessarily from record sales anymore these days. Because a lot of people just don't buy physical media. So it's always a surprise to me to find people are listening and connecting to the music at all. Very pleasant surprise. Yeah.
Well, I guess, there's some artists that, have dual careers. You've had like half a dozen different names of bands and releases that have come out over the years. Do people tend to come along to the shows because of Porcupine Tree? Maybe it's Storm Corrosion. Do you sort of work out, where the fan base sort of starts off, the basis of it?
I think, it's kind of, as you say, there's a real kind of sense of it being a mixture. I mean, there are some people who know my work from the fact that I now have a kind of reputation for working with classic, 70s albums. So I have a new generation of fans that are, in a sense, an older generation of fans that have come to me because I've worked with King Crimson, Jethro Tull. There are people who've been following my work through Porcupine Tree. There are people who've discovered my music through the solo records as well. I mean, the new solo record is actually probably my most successful record ever. More so than any Porcupine Tree record, even in terms of acclaim and even sales. It's pretty much been more successful than anything I've done before now, which is fantastic. But of course, I think most people in Australia probably know me for the Porcupine Tree connection. But that's fine. The thing is, of course, Porcupine Tree was very much it was my writing too. So there's a sense of continuity in the sense that I wrote most of the music for that band. So the solo work is not such a kind of big leap for people. It's a different band, of course. It's a slightly different sound, but there is that continuity there in the writing.
Let's run through some of those names then, so we can sort of get the status of where everyone's up to at the moment. Porcupine Tree, for instance, I guess 1997 to 2010 is that an ongoing process though?
Well, historically, Porcupine Tree was one of several things I started to do at the beginning of my career, and it was the one that just happened to take off, and I didn't plan it that way, but it took off, which was fantastic. But I never planned really for anything to be. Here's the thing, I think if you look at it from this point of view, if you said to anyone that was kind of leaving school that they were going to go into a job and that they were going to do the same job with the same people for the rest of their life, they'd be horrified. But there's something about being in a band that has a kind of a name and it's a successful brand that people kind of expect you to keep doing it forever. I don't really kind of look at it that way. For me, one of the gifts of being a professional musician is the opportunity to be able to work with different people, to do different things, to do different jobs, to collaborate with people from different countries, different musical backgrounds. So I'm kind of making the most of that, and I realise that's kind of a selfish way to look at things. But Porcupine Tree, as I say, as you pointed out, I did for 15 years. I want to do different things, and I want to work with different people. But that doesn't mean that Porcupine Tree won't still do something else together again. So my answer is usually there's no bad news, but there's no good news either right now. So we'll see. We'll see.
Well, No-Man sort of kicked off the same year as Porcupine Tree, wasn't it? Around
yes, absolutely. In fact, predated it. In fact, yeah, that was before Porcupine Tree.
Yeah,
and that's also been on hiatus for a while. And again, I can imagine a time when I might do another record with Tim as No-Man. But right now, I've kind of put everything, No-Man, Blackfield, Porcupine Tree, all the other things I've done, I've kind of said, okay, I'm not going to do those for a while. I'm going to do some different things. So Storm Corrosion, for example, was a new thing. The solo career was a new thing, and I'm also, as I say, I'm doing a lot more work these days, remixing classic albums, which I love doing, and which is very educational too for me. So those are the kind of new things for me.
The incredible Expanding Mindfuck.
Yeah, again, that's kind of, I've kind of put a lid on that. That was a one-off experiment. Yeah.
You got a nice body of work out of that, though.
I've put a lot of records out. Not all of them I'm as proud of as the other. Some of them I'm proud of, and some of them I'm less proud of. But I've been very curious, shall we say? I think is the word. I've been very curious about exploring lots of different musics, and I think this is what I mean when I said to you earlier that when I sort of started my career, I started a bunch of projects, and most of them were focused on a particular aspect of my musical interest. So Incredible Expanding Mindfuck, for example, was very much focused on my love of krautrock. Porcupine Tree was focused on my love of sort of progressive and psychedelic and art rock. No-Man was more kind of, almost had a kind of an orchestral sweep to it. Blackfield was more about, the art of classic pop songwriting. So they were all kind of aspects of my musical personality. And as I say, Porcupine Tree was the one that seemed to connect best with people at that time. But I think the interesting thing about my solo career is that it has the kind of potential to tap into all of those things, and sometimes simultaneously, which is why I felt that it was time to actually put my name, to something. And in a sense, I felt that I was always moving towards that point. Anyway.
So what does the show revolve around then, when you've got so many albums that you've done over the years?
Well, obviously, this particular show is focused on The Raven That Refused to Sing, and each of the albums themselves have been quite different. I mean, this album has, in many ways, has been a bit of a love letter to classic progressive rock, much more so than the first two solo records. So that's the show kind of continues that theme. It's got a lot of the elements from visual elements from the artwork and from the songs. The sense of the songs being based on supernatural stories, ghost stories. And I'm touring with the band that made that record, so it's focused on that record for sure.
And how long has that band been together as an entity?
Since literally the first time that band played together was the first time we stepped into the studio to start recording the records. I've been very lucky with my musicians in my solo band. I mean, I didn't have any great master plan, and I just put together a bunch of musicians, some of whom I'd worked with before, some of whom I hadn't, but I knew by reputation. And I also put together a mixture of musicians from different backgrounds. I mean, I specifically wanted a kind of collision of rock sensibility and jazz sensibility. Which could have gone horribly wrong, but it just worked so well. And I think there was a lot of luck. It was there was a lot of serendipity involved in that. It just seemed to gel very well. This band just seemed to work so well together, despite being from these two quite disparate backgrounds. And that's been kind of luck in a way.
Yeah, and I guess it would be quite difficult to find that element of musician to work with on a permanent basis. Like with Bass Communion, for instance, when you went into the studio, and I think Robert Fripp was with you at one point in the studio there. Like when you're doing something, with a big name, but it just happens to be a one-off, does that give you a wider aspect to experiment with?
Well, I think, I'm in a very fortunate position in the sense that, there's two ways of looking at it. I mean, I'm working obviously in the 21st century. There are pros and cons about working in this particular time in the music industry and working in the particular style I work in. The pros are that there's not a lot of gigs for those kind of guys out there now. In the 70s, for example, these guys would have been probably very much in demand. They might have been going off and playing with Frank Zappa or, or Peter Gabriel or someone like that. But now there's not a lot of gigs for these guys. There's not a lot of gigs for guys like Guthrie Govan, the guitar player I have today, or Adam Holtzman, the keyboard player who played with Miles in the 80s. Those kind of guys that are extraordinary musicians, they have a choice. They can either go and play sort of instrumental music in small clubs, but to actually come out and play this kind of music and to be able to play to relatively large audiences and relatively large venues, there aren't a lot of gigs for those guys. So in a way, I'm lucky that I have the pick of these kind of musicians, because there's not a lot of people giving them these kind of opportunities to show what they can do, but within the context of songs. The downside, of course, is that it is a struggle to play this kind of music in this day and age. It's not mainstream. It's music which is very much considered to be outside of the mainstream. So selling every ticket and selling every record is a struggle, And if I'd been releasing a record like The Raven and the Refuse to Sing in the 70s, I'd have probably found it much easier to reach an audience. It's been tough. I'm not complaining, because, as I say, there are pros and cons, And as I say, the reason I mention that is I think one of the real advantages now is that these guys are not getting a lot of opportunities to show what they can do within this kind of context. And so I'm fortunate to be able to attract people like Guthrie and Adam to play with me.
So I guess in some ways it's almost a bit like a time warp, isn't it? Because we had I guess we go back to the Jethro Tull era of one of those bands that you've worked with, Marillion, acts like that, prog rock of the 70s. For somebody like you, I guess, going back to an era like that, would you think you probably would have fitted in better?
I think so. I think so. I mean, my music definitely has always had that kind of DNA. I mean, I grew up. I didn't grow up in that era, but I grew up hearing that music, and from my father and from my best friend's big brother, who was 10 years older. He had a record collection that was very much, it had come from that era. So we were listening to bands like that when we were very young. When most of my friends at school were listening to 80s bands, and I was listening to those 80s bands too, and I loved that music too, and I still love that music too. So I have this kind of real melting pot of kind of inspirations and influences. But I think, objectively speaking, that it's very hard to make a case for the music scene now being as strong as it was in the 70s. And I think, even the most sort of like progressive, and I mean that in the true sense of the word, rather than the accepted sense, the most progressive music fan would have to admit that the 70s is a golden era. You just think of the bands, the Zeppelins, the Floyds, the Who, It's not just about the progressive rock. I think that era was a kind of golden era for all styles of music, And it's difficult now to not look back and feel a little bit of nostalgia. And it's no coincidence to me that a lot of the kids that listen to my music, and there are a lot of kids who listen to my music now, are coming to the music because they've discovered, it goes two ways actually. Either they discover my music and then through that music they discover the 70s music, or they've discovered the 70s music and they find my music through that. So that doesn't surprise me, because there's something about 70s music that has a quality. It feels like it was a golden age for rock music, and it's a shame. It's like I said to you a few minutes ago. It's a shame in a way not to be a part of that, but at the same time, it does make what I'm doing now more unique. There's not a lot of people out there doing it.
No.
I would have probably been competing with a lot more impressive music at that time, and apart from the bands that are still doing it, there's still some bands out there. I mean, Camel have just reformed, King Crimson have just reformed. So apart from the bands from that era that's still doing it, there's not a lot of people out there doing it now. So in a way, that means I am a bigger fish in a smaller pond, whereas it would have been the opposite way around in the 70s.
Well, I guess you grew up in the 70s in England. At the start of the 70s, we had Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd. At the end of the 70s, we had Sex Pistols, and then bordering on the new romantic movement that was happening. So how was that roller coaster for you then?
Well, it's all part of my DNA. This is it. I mean, I think, I when I became aware of music, it was right at the end of the 70s, early 80s. And I was listening to bands like The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, Japan, XTC, a lot of the post-punk stuff, Public Image Limited, and that's all in my musical DNA too. And if it hadn't been for my dad and my best friend's big brother, who was a few years older than us, I probably would have never heard bands like Camel and Hawkwind and Pink Floyd and Tangerine Dream. But I did hear those bands. And I guess a lot of the kids at school that I was at school with didn't get that musical education, and I did, and I think that's been one of the interesting things for me, is having the dual sensibility has given the music perhaps a little bit more of a unique edge to it. Because that is in there too, The Raven, as I say, the new album is not so much. It's more of a kind of. It does look more back to the classic era of the '70s. But my first solo record, for example, Into Hentes, which came out in 2009, was very much influenced more by 80s music, by bands like Cocteau Twins, by bands like the Wire and Magazine, and so that I like that idea of being able to tap into those different aspects of my musical background.
I think I read somewhere where you were equally influenced by Pink Floyd and Donna Summer.
Absolutely. Well, the story I always tell people, and I tell it to people because it's true, is that my mum and dad one Christmas gave each other records, and my father received Dark Side of the Moon from my mother, and my mother received the classic Donna Summer, Giorgio Moroder collaboration, Love to Love You Baby. So I would just hear those two records back to back. And the interesting thing about both those records, you think in a way they're from completely different, disparate backgrounds. But I think actually the one thing they have in common, I don't know how well you know the Donna Summer record, but that Love to Love You Baby, the first side of that record is a 16-minute long disco symphony. Yeah. And it is this idea of music as a kind of journey, as a kind of musical continuum, something that develops and goes through different sections, different textures, different emotions. And I completely hooked into that through both records, that idea of the album as a kind of musical journey, and not being tied to the kind of traditional pop song form, the 3-minute pop song form. And that was kind of at the very basis of my musical DNA right from the very beginning, because of those two records, which surprisingly have that in common.
You lived for a while in Tel Aviv. What was that like musically for you, and how did that influence you?
Musically less, but I think in terms of my personality, a lot. One of the things about being English is that you do kind of inherit this inherent Englishness, to your personality, and so that kind of reserve. It's a cliche to talk about it, but it's a cliche because it's true. That there is this sense of kind of reserve, and the Israelis are the complete antithesis of that. They're crazy, they're passionate, they are full on, whereas English people tend to be, they have this sort of sense of, equilibrium. And my parents are no exception, don't express your emotions very often. You kind of stay very much within yourself. And the Israelis are complete opposite. They're either on 11 or they're on 0, there's nothing in between. And I absolutely loved that. I loved it because for me, it was completing in a way my personality. And I learned so much about being more extroverted, about being able to perform more, to be more of a front man. And it's no coincidence that, I'm now performing as a front man. I mean, I'm not even holding a guitar in my show. Now, before I went to Israel, that would have been completely out of the question. The idea that I would perform and be this kind of extroverted frontman type of character, I don't think that ever would have happened without the influence of the kind of Israeli culture, which is all it's much more kind of in your face, and some people hate it. Some people say the Israelis have this reputation for being very kind of rude. I don't think it's rudeness. I just think it's just it's honesty, and it's kind of like upfrontness, and I really responded very positively to that.
You work with Aviv Geffen, and in Blackfield.
Yeah.
Was that during your Israeli period?
Yeah, I mean that was kind of the reason I went there was essentially to make a record. We were doing the second Blackfield record at the time, and I thought, well, why don't I just come and live in Blackfield, live in Israel while we make this Blackfield record? So I ended up. It wasn't a long time. I was there for less than a year, but it was enough to feel like I was more than just a tourist, you know. And it was definitely a changing experience. Yeah.
Mm. Well, Stephen Wilson, it's a fascinating story. It's good to get you back live in Australia.
Thank you.
And we thank you for joining us here at
My pleasure.
noise11.com.
Thank you for having me.